Well, hello everybody. This is Mr. Moffin coming at you. Hopefully everyone's doing okay. Today we're going to be taking a look at topic 2.6, which is focusing in on slavery in the British colonies. Now, of course, when we talk about slavery in the British colonies, there are many different factors to consider. You know, for example, social factors, racial factors, but also, of course, the core of it in many respects, economic factors. Now, slavery making its way into the Western Hemisphere in the British colonies is not going to happen by accident. The first initial desire to create what's going to define slavery by the time we get to the 1700s was because of a dwindling native population that's going to be dying off, mostly from disease, but also from fights with European settlers. Now, understand that the need for labor is going to be in the realm of trying to maintain mostly large plantations that are going to be focusing in on cash crops in certain areas of the colonies. For example, tobacco in Virginia, rice in South Carolina, sugar cane in the West Indies, etc., etc. So initially, after natives proved to be a not so viable labor source, then you see a movement towards indentured servitude. And we've mentioned this before in class, but keep in mind when we talk about indentured servitude, this is going to be made up of white Europeans. So think primarily British folks that are going to be willing to surrender their freedom in exchange for passage to North America. And what this is setting up an actual labor contract. These contracts typically were, about 5 years of labor, though it could be as many as 10 or even 15 years of labor, depending on, what is involved in the contract. Now, we mentioned previously that the headright system is going to play a very important role in promoting this institution of indentured servitude. Once again, providing 50 acres of land for each person that was brought over as an indentured servant. And of course, we know this only exacerbated the wide wealth gap in the southern and Chesapeake colonies. Anyhow, it seemed to work for a while during the mid 17th century into the 1660s, 1670s. But you may recall that Bacon's Rebellion is going to prove that indentured servitude is going to be problematic. One problem that these plantation owners realized is that when these white colonists that have fulfilled their contract for servitude is up, then the question becomes, well, then what? These folks are going to get their freedom, and depending on the contract, they might be getting something like, corn and maybe bolts of cloth or whatever, but typically are not going to be getting land as a result, and are going to, be upset when they do not have access to land. The basic gist of it is that white Europeans had a tradition of enjoying rights, even when as indentured servants, still had a sense of rights that they were entitled to. And when you add all this up, we see another shift in the type of labor source that's going to be utilized in the colonies, and that is going to be coming from West African slaves. The first African slaves will be brought over in 1619, even though these folks were actually indentured servants, not technically slaves in the modern sense that we think of. But understand that 1619 serves as a very pivotal moment in our history, because now we're going to be factoring in race in terms of being white versus black in playing a role in terms of defining not just who is the labor class, but also the rights that go along with that. Now, one thing we need to make sure that we understand is that slavery will be ubiquitous across all of the British colonies. That being said, it's not going to be evenly distributed in terms of where these slaves are going to be. If you look at just what are going to be the American colonies, you'll see that in New England, there's going to be, there's definitely going to be far fewer than in the middle colonies, and then even more as further south as you go. So if you are looking at, where is slavery going to be found, just keep going south. The further south that you go, you're going to be seeing more slaves. even though slavery will exist everywhere as we get into the 1700s. Now, if you were to be an African slave in the American colonies, you will probably be in some type of southern plantation, be it in the Carolinas or in Georgia, something along those lines, working on a big, massive plantation, working for one of these very, very, very wealthy planters that dominated those areas. Now, that being said, what we were doing initially is just kind of showing differentiation based on the American colonies. But if you go back to this map once again, you can see that in contrast to the American slaves that are going to be making their way here, if you contrast that with the slaves headed for the Caribbean, headed for the West Indies, places like, for example, Jamaica or Barbados and places like that, you can see that the vast majority of West African slaves will be making their way into the Caribbean region and will have a dramatic effect on defining the ethnicity of some of these locations in the future, such as British Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas. If you look at French Haiti, Spanish Cuba, Spanish Dominican Republic, it's going to be obviously a major impact on the ethnicity and culture of these areas that will emerge in the future. Now, as we go through the 17th century, as we go through the 1600s, and more British colonies are being set up in the Western Hemisphere, the demand for slaves is just going to increase. It's just going to keep on going as we get through the 17th century and into the 18th century. Now, part of that, remember, was in response to the events happening with Bacon's Rebellion. Black African slaves do not have this ingrained sense of rights that they are entitled to as compared to Englishmen that are coming over, even if they were indentured servants. We also are seeing a slight decline in immigration to the colonies right around 1700 or so, due to increasing economic conditions back in Europe, in particularly England. So remember, the number one reason why people move is for economic purposes, and if the economy is doing better back where you already are, you're less inclined to move somewhere else. And note that the agricultural production is just going to be increasing and increasing and increasing. More tobacco being grown, more rice that's going to be grown, you name it, and that has to be done by human labor. And so there's going to be more and more demand. And where that labor has come from is now, pretty much, only coming from West African / Black American born slaves. So what we're seeing here is something that's going to be very, very important. We are now starting to associate the economic status of slavery with being black in the American colonies. We do not associate white with a servant class, as a slave class, as indentured servitude is starting to phase its way out. So understand that as we get into the 18th century, we are seeing something very significant happening. We are associating whiteness with freedom and having rights that whites are entitled to, and being black and being associated with slavery, being associated with being of the servant class and with no real rights being associated with them. So we are applying racial factors to economic status in these colonies, and this is going to have a profound impact on defining the social relations amongst whites and blacks in the American colonies. Now, when we do talk about slaves losing or not enjoying rights, what we actually do see is that it's a gradual removal of pre-existing rights that already were on the books. Once again, remember, prior to the influx of African slaves coming over and black slave labor, labor was associated with some degree of rights and protections. But as race becomes applied to servitude, those rights then start to get stripped to a point where slaves are just pure property, as if, talking about, livestock or furniture or something like that. of course, slavery being the dehumanizing institution that it is. As you can see here, there are some examples of some of these rights that are going to be taken away as we go through the 17th century. For example, the association with being a slave based on your parents being a slave. That was not something that was associated with white Europeans. If you were an indentured servant, that didn't mean that your child was an indentured servant. But now we're making that connection that if you are black and you are a slave, your children are also going to be slaves in perpetuity as well. And note, as property, these families could be sold off and separated on a whim at a moment's notice. And once again, think about the horrific experience that so many families are going to be having, where husbands and wives are separated forever, parents and children are separated forever, siblings are separated forever. That's just one component of the many components of what made slavery so despicable. Additionally, the idea that maybe if you are a slave that you find Jesus and you become baptized as a Christian, that used to be the basis by which you could attain freedom. But once again, as we're associating race with conditions of servitude, that's not going to be a protection anymore. We also start to see more and more rigid lines being drawn between ethnicity and race in these colonies, particularly as the further south that we go, and not just saying that blacks do not enjoy certain rights that whites do. There's also this beginning of an attempt to, in reality, segregate the races, that it's not just one group is not the servant class and another group is. It's making a firm attempt to try to separate these groups in society. So, for example, you could not interracially marry in these colonies as time goes on. So understand that we are seeing a very firm stripping away of rights and firmly associating skin color with some degree of either freedom or being a servant, and that is going to be entrenched for a long time. Now, as slavery becomes more and more common, more and more entrenched, we do see at the same time slaves trying to withstand these conditions. Remember, these are slave conditions. These are brutal conditions. So we saw attempts such as working slow or maybe refusing to work, sabotaging tools and equipment, maybe even running away as a very desperate attempt to try to avoid slave labor. Now remember, as a slave, you get no financial benefit for your labor. So why would you work to your most efficient or work at your very best? Also, the ultimate weapon that slaves might have, if they could properly organize and were about as fearless as you could get, would be slave uprisings. Now, these were very few and far between, but still, though, these were the worst nightmares of any kind of plantation owners. You have to understand, as we go through this time period, whites are starting to become outnumbered pretty significantly by black slaves. And so realizing that numerical distinction, whites are going to do their very best to try to make sure that there's no possibility of organizing slave rebellions by creating rules in terms of limiting assemblies of black slaves, limiting access in terms of literacy, having harsh punishments for some of these violations, etc. And then to kind of round this out, we will also see black slaves resist slavery from a cultural perspective, that even though white slave owners are going to try to destroy traditional cultural values in terms of language and religion and various norms and values, we're still going to be seeing an attempt to try to maintain these traditions, be it through the banjo, be it through the language of Gullah, etc., etc. We're still going to see some attempts to try to maintain these values. So we are coming up on 15 minutes, which is as long as I've got. So I'm going to end it right there. That is the only video for this topic. So if you do have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.